Welcome to All Things Victorian. I'm Victoriana Lady Lisa, and I'm so excited that you've tuned in again. We're going to go through a wonderful Victorian fashion overview today. I brought some special things from my collection. I'm also going to show you some beautiful pieces that I have on the dress forms. What do you think is the first thing that a Victorian woman put on in the morning when she was getting dressed? It's not what you think. Most people think it's the corset, but contrary to popular belief, the first thing she would put on in the morning were her stockings. And there's a very good reason for that. You see, once she had the corset on, there was no way she was going to bend down and button or tie her boots. You will find that the Victorian women were very practical. They were dressed from the feet on up. So I'm going to take you through what grandmother had to wear, and you are going to be amazed at all of the layers that grandmother had to wear to get dressed. And this went for the working class, the middle class, and the wealthy. My first item that I'd like to show you is called the chemise. This is also referred to as a shift. Many of the working class wore these as nightgowns. The Victorians layered their undergarments not only for modesty's sake, but also to absorb perspiration. The outer clothes were silk many times, or they had buttons and beads on them, and they were not easy to wash. So the Victorian woman would wash all of her undergarments. I know it seems strange to us today. And they only washed their hair once a week and took a bath once a month, but it was all right because everybody smelled the same. This is a combination because it has the chemise, it's similar to a corset cover, and the split drawers. This is also a very unusual piece. The Victorians believed that it was not healthy for a woman to have clothing directly against her skin. And this was prior to 1910, so this was late 18th century. This was the next piece that went on. And now we will get into our bloomers. These were named for Amelia Jenks Bloomer, who started the bloomer fashion. These are a really pretty set that I have. You can see the ribbons. This would have been probably for a bridal trousseau. Yes, there are a lot of layers that the Victorian woman had to wear, and they wore them whether it was 30 degrees or 90 degrees. This is a pair of split drawers. They're longer for, of course, colder months. Even Queen Victoria wore split drawers. In fact, they were recently auctioned off. Finally, we're going to get into the corset. The reason that the corset was not worn first on the skin is because it would chafe the woman's skin. And also, these were more difficult to clean. So again, the layering would absorb the perspiration. Pardon my modern hangers, but some of these are so delicate and so fragile that they cannot be modeled on any person, and they won't even go on some of the dress forms because they're really so tiny. So this is the best way that I can show them to you. This is a corset from the Civil War era. This has the whale boning in it. This was the early corset with whale boning. Corsets came in a lot of shapes and sizes and styles. This is one of my favorites in my collection. This is a brocade corset. This was from around 1870, 1880, and this was worn by a very wealthy woman. How do I know that? Not only the beautiful brocade design, but her laces are also made of silk. So this was a very wealthy woman that wore this, probably to a ball. All right, she's halfway dressed. Bear with me. After the corset comes another item called the corset cover. The corset cover looks very much like a modern camisole today. This was worn to hide the boning from the corset from showing through to the lady's dress, and also it was another layer of modesty. Modesty was the decorum of the day for the Victorian woman. I have a lovely set here that was from Bridal Trousseau, and in later shows we'll be getting into more detail with the clothing. We will be getting into more detail with strictly bridal fashions. This is just an overview, and I just have so much that I want to show you, and I look forward to doing that. These are beautiful lace pieces, very, very delicate. This is the corset cover, and these are the drawers, as you can see. And these were for a wedding or a bridal trousseau. Now I know you're probably thinking, how old was the bride? Was she 6 years old? Those are awfully small. Well, the Victorians were very small in stature. They didn't have the vitamins, the prenatal vitamins that we have today, and they walked and they worked a lot, so they burned off a lot of the food that they ate. Now, depending on what decade you were in, if you were in the 1870s or the 1880s, you were going to wear something like this. What in heaven's name are these? They look like handbags, but they're actually bustle forms. Yes, these would tie on the woman's waist, and she would have the bustle pad on her back. This one is wire, and it would have originally had a lot of padding on it, and then this one is just filled with some padding. Also, one of the styles of the decade was the hoop, or better known as the cage. This was very popular. Hoops from the 1850s and 60s all the way into the early 70s, and then of course you had the bustle that came in. So can you imagine so far putting all of this on, and you don't even have your clothes on yet? Can you imagine what grandmother had to go through? You know, for them, though, it was all they knew. They were brought up with a corset from a very young age. Some girls were corseted as young as 6 years old. We're almost finished with our undergarments. This is a beautiful example of a bustle slip. It has buttonholes on the sides, and this would actually button on to another petticoat that the lady would wear. And the ruffles and the fullness would give her that shelf look, which at the time was a sign of beauty. Many women layered petticoats as a sign of status. These are two beautiful examples of petticoats in my collection. They came in all types of styles. This one has some crochet work, this one has some whitework needlework. And if you were wealthy, you could afford to wear anywhere from 8 to 10 petticoats, and people knew you were wealthy by your outfit and by the fullness of your skirts. Also, all of this had a purpose in covering the woman's legs, which incidentally were called limbs at that time. You couldn't even say the word leg. In fact, pianos had covers on their legs as well. I know, it seems odd, but there are a lot of very interesting, fascinating things about the Victorian lady and the era. One last undergarment is another petticoat. This one is in black. We'll get into some mourning things in another show, but this was a black petticoat. Often the whites were dyed black if someone passed away. And speaking of mourning, this could be suitable for mourning outfit, or sometimes the Victorian women just simply wore black, especially if they were of the working class, because it was easier to clean. It didn't show quite as much dirt. So this was a very sturdy kind of a dress for the average Victorian woman. If you were of the wealthy class, you would wear a beautiful bodice like this. Now this one is unique in that it has boning inside, and it's fascinating to see how these are constructed. And we'll get into more detail in later shows about all of that. But this is trimmed with beautiful jet beading. This also could have been worn for second year mourning. And this was a very wealthy woman that wore this. Unfortunately, I don't have the matching skirt because many of the skirts were long. This is from the 1880s, and many of the trains drug on the ground, so they didn't always survive. The streets were very muddy at the time. Keep in mind, they were not paved, so some of the skirts have not survived. This is a wonderful example of an 1890s bodice. You can see the puffing of the sleeves. This is made of silk. Lovely, lovely buttons. Some are missing, but I'm so grateful for this piece. It was donated to me, and I'm so thankful that they didn't throw it out because some of the buttons were missing. I'm very fortunate to have had many of my items donated to me in my collection, and I do cherish them. I'm working on a Victorian and an Edwardian book, and they will also be included in my book. Many of the Victorian women would wear various types of jackets. Sometimes they would wear cuffs and collars to change their look. Many skirts had a bodice for day wear and also a detachable bodice, something else that they could wear for evening. This was also recently donated to me by a lady from Gloucester, Sue Wright, her family, and this is a beautiful silk jacket. And it's in really, really good condition. And I'm sure the lady that wore this looked wonderful. I have some outerwear I'd like to show you. This is very, very heavy. This is a sealskin cape. Now keep in mind at that time, the only thing that they had for warmth were furs and wool. So if you were wealthy, you could afford a beautiful fur cape such as this. And this had beading even in the back. Very sumptuous. This was worn in the 1870s, 1880s over the bustle dresses. I have another lovely, lovely cape that was also worn over the bustle. This is a stunning silk, and we'll get into details again on the fabrics, but it has beautiful soutache and lace trim on it. What an elegant woman that wore this. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my outfit. This jacket was donated to me, and I'm very thankful again for all the wonderful donations that I receive. People don't know what to do with some of the pieces because their family doesn't want them, so I cherish them. This is from the 1890s, the early 1890s, and also my skirt, and the hat is period. I have a beautiful morning brooch on that I can't wait till we do the morning show, and I can show you a little bit about the morning jewelry. We'll get into that in later episodes too. We're going to try to cover everything in the Victorian era. I also have some lovely, lovely pieces on the dress forms here. This one is also from the early 1890s, late 1880s, early 1890s, and I hope that it picks up the trim on this because it's absolutely beautiful. This is called a soutache trim, and this is a cotton wool blend. This was a traveling suit, and we have the jaunty little hat that goes with it, and this was donated to me by a very dear friend as well, and it's wonderful that the skirt has survived with the bodice. I'm very grateful for that. As I said, sometimes we do lose the skirts. This is one of my favorite pieces. This was one of my very first acquisitions many, many years ago. And if you'll recall, in the earlier shows, I started my collecting at the age of 15 years old. This is wonderful and very rare because it has the three pieces intact. We have the beautiful, beautiful hat, which I just want to show you quickly. This is adorable. This is the epitome of the 1890s, the 1895, 1896. I don't know if you're a fan of Anne of Green Gables. It's one of my favorite stories, and I loved it as a child. If you recall, Anne dreamed and longed for a dress with puffed sleeves. Well, I don't think you can get puffier sleeves than this. This is a wonderful example of the sleeves of that era. And you're probably wondering, how did they keep them so full? Well, they actually had arm pads similar to the bustle pads that I showed you, where women could pad their arms and get this full effect. In fact, many women in the Victorian era were very well padded. And it's kind of funny when you think about it. They would pad their derriere. They also had bust pads. They had the corset, which really cinched their waist. They wore hair pieces and all of those articles of clothing. Can you imagine on the wedding night when finally she took off all of her pads? I wonder if the husband even recognized who his wife was. But getting back to this beauty, this is a lovely traveling suit, and it's a wool blend, and it has beautiful, beautiful velvet trim here. So this is one that I really, really cherish in my collection. Some of the other things that women would wear were accessories. This is a lovely hand crocheted piece. There was a lot of work that went into this. This was something that was worn as a shawl for the lady, and this showed their handiwork. Now you wonder, what in the world did the Victorians do before they had television and all of our computers and things? Well, they spent a lot of time doing needlework, sewing, making their clothes. Even though the sewing machine was invented, the Victorian era, later in the Victorian era, still all of the beadwork and the lace was done by hand. And a lot of the clothing was very difficult to put on. They had tiny little buttons, and I have small fingers, and it's tedious for me to button a lot of the articles of clothing. This suit, for example, has about 14 different hooks and eyes just on the bodice. So can you imagine painstakingly having to hook all of these? Well, that's what the Victorians did with a lot of their time. They spent a lot of time just trying to get dressed, and then if you were wealthy, you went and changed your outfits several times a day. You could have an outfit for morning. For your breakfast, you'd wear what's called a wrapper. Then you would have something when you would receive callers, you would change for that. Then you would change again for lunch. Later in the day, you might go out and make a call, so you would put on a traveling suit, such as I showed you. You'd come back and you'd have dinner, another outfit. And then, perhaps, you would go to the opera. So you would have a beautiful, beautiful gown on, and you would go out later in the evening, and then you'd come back, and finally, you would be able to put your nightwear on. So there were many, many changes, and when a Victorian woman was fully dressed from head to toe with all of her layers, her undergarments, with her outer layers, with her coats and her accessories, the hats and everything, it was not unusual for her to have 20 extra pounds on. Can you imagine that? I don't know about you, but I'm tired just thinking about it. These wonderful pieces are just a fraction of my collection. We're going to get into so many things in the next couple episodes. I'm going to take you into more of the fashions. We're going to do fashions from the Edwardian era. Again, the Edwardian era is a branch off the Victorian family tree, so we're going to get into that because the fashions were evolving and women were still wearing the corsets. I'm going to get into all kinds of accessories. Again, the jewelry that I'm wearing, I have some beautiful mourning pieces. I'm going to get into the handbags, the hats. Oh, I can't wait till we do the show on the hats. Wait until you see all of the wonderful, wonderful hats. And many of the hats, like from the Titanic era, which is in the Edwardian era, are spectacular and have beautiful big feathers. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but in the 1920s, the National Audubon Society came into existence because the Victorians had such a voracious appetite for feathers and birds on their hats. Sometimes they even had taxidermy birds on their hats. Well, they just about made the ostrich extinct, so they had to pass the law that protected them. But again, the wealthy Victorian woman loved to display her wealth, and part of that was in her fashion. Now, a lot of what you see and many of the pieces that I've showed you are from the upper middle class or the higher class. They were able to afford this type of finery. And you know, when we think of the Victorian era, we think of the marvelous gowns and the beautiful pieces, but we will get into some of the lesser clothing. We'll probably do an immigrant program at one point, and we can get into some of the things that your grandmother, my grandmother probably wore for everyday use. And we'll get into the servants and what they had to wear. So there is a lot that we're going to cover, and I'm just so excited that you're tuned in here. We're going to have a wonderful time as I take you back in time. And again, I'm inspired by my grandmother, who really started my interest in the Victorian era. She brought out a shoebox of old photos, and I was just mesmerized with the clothing. Finding out that I had a grandfather in the Civil War was fascinating to me, and I began to research everything about that era and the Victorian era. So many of the things that you're going to see came out of my genealogy. It was just fascinating, and I'm just really grateful to have this opportunity. Who would have ever thought way back at 15 years old, when I was saving my babysitting money and going to estate sales and antique shows and auctions, that it would lead to something like this. But I do cherish these pieces. I do take donations in any condition. Really, to me, these pieces are treasures. They're works of art, and they really should be preserved for future generations. So again, I'm just so thankful to have this opportunity to open up the trunks and share all of the wonderful pieces that I've acquired. We will be getting into, in another episode, the Edwardians, specifically the Titanic era fashions. We'll be getting into a lot of the accessories. The Victorian woman couldn't accessorize enough, and just like today, you know, accessories make the outfit. So I'm going to get into so many wonderful things that the Victorian woman liked to accessorize with. Some of them are very unique, very unusual, so we're going to do a show with some of the unique Victorian things that might have fallen out of fashion, and that'll be fun to kind of show you, you know, what they wore or what that certain gadget was for. And I just really hope that you learn a lot from this. I'm really enjoying imparting this information to you, and it's a privilege for me to be able to share this history. And I really hope that you come away from these programs entertained and enjoying what you're learning. I really want to get out in the community too and meet everyone. If you have any type of beautiful antique pieces like this, would love to hear from you so that we can interview you and get you on the show. We can get you here in studio, or I can come to your home. I'd love to hear your stories. I'd love to see what you have. In future shows, I'm going to be talking about how you can preserve your textiles, the proper way to store them. As you see, these were stored well over the years, or they wouldn't be with us today. So that's very important too. So I really want to just cover all types of interesting things about this wonderful, wonderful era. And again, please get in touch with me. My name is Lisa, Victoriana Lady Lisa, and you can reach me at victorianalady.com, and you can also get the information at the end of the show. And I thank you so much for tuning in to All Things Victorian.